So Michael, you've been we're relatively new to your current role, but I'm told you've got 22 really fantastic years in the industry. Would you like to introduce yourself and the brand and maybe the lineup we're going to go through tonight with Compass Box?
Yeah, thank you very much, Luke. So my name is Michael Stephenson, new UK brand ambassador for Compass Box Whiskey. I've been in this industry in some way, shape, and form for longer than I haven't been, put it that way. So a good 20 to 21, 22 years, various different roles, all the way from working in bars to working for corporate liquor companies to working on cruise ships for a while. I was running my own whiskey and cocktail bar for a good number of years. And now I have the pleasure of looking after this lovely portfolio of whiskies that I'm a massive fan of. So yeah, excited to be able to share it all with you tonight. I think the basic idea, for us to do is give you, at some point tonight, we'll go through a little bit of an overview of what Compass Box is about, what our story is, and sort of what our aim and goal is as a company. We'll go through our lineup. So if I can show it to you quickly while we are all going through, just so that everyone's on the same page. We'll start off tonight with the Hedonism, just so that you can order yourselves up. We will follow that up with the Artist Blend. So that'll be our second whiskey of the evening. The third one we will move on to is the Orchard House. Fourth one will be the Spice Tree. And then obviously finishing up then with your Peat Monster. So just so that we're all on the same page and we can get into that. I think I'm going to share my screen if that's okay. And then we'll kick off with a little bit of a story about Compass Box.
Kevin in the chat has jumped in there, but has Compass Box got a website? I imagine you have you?
Yes, www.compassboxwhiskey.com.
Fantastic. And we've already got a few comments on the weather. Scott says it's a blustery in Edinburgh. And Steve said it's wild and windy in Knots, which sounds like the sequel to Sleepless in Seattle or something. I don't know. It's something very...
well, hopefully everyone's able to hold on to their drams at least and warm themselves up.
Indeed. And before we start with your slide, hedonism or hedonism? I suppose one of those things. I had a conversation with someone today, but was it lever or lever?
I mean, as far as I understand, it's hedonism, but I suppose everything has its regionalities. And being a South African who is in the UK speaking about Scotch whiskey, sometimes you can take my pronunciation with a grain of salt. So.
Very good. And a last bit of housekeeping before we jump into that, which, as I forgot to mention at the start, is we do, for anyone who's first time joining us in one of these tastings, we do want to hear your tasting notes and your questions throughout in the chat. Please do be as engaged as possible. So anyway, back over to yourself, Michael.
Yeah, fantastic. So I think the best place to start is we'll give you a quick overview of Compass Box and our story, and then we will try and move on to drinking some fantastic whiskey. So Compass Box, we were started in the year 2000. We were started by an American gentleman, Mr. John Glaser. So John was actually a really big wine fanatic. He still is very much into his wine and had studied wine and was aiming to get into the world of blending wine. And then started applying for positions. And one of the first ones that came up actually was a position in whiskey. So he decided to heed the call and moved over to the UK. Couldn't quite convince his wife to move over to Scotland, so he ended up in London, and he got into the world of whiskey with one of the big blenders at the time. So it was a company called United Distillers. He was working for them, so blending some of the big blending brands that you'll be very familiar with. And he fell in love with whiskey. John actually says that he's still got a video of the exact moment that it happened. He was in the Talisker distillery drinking out of one of those big graduating cylinders. And he said when the liquid hit him in the face, that's when he knew that he was in love. So it started off a magical journey for him. And he was working for the blenders. But what he started to notice was that it just started getting a bit monotonous with the blenders. You know, everyone was sort of trying to make very similar styles of whiskey. There wasn't a whole lot of innovation happening. And even from the bottling point of view, you know, a lot of the labeling looked like it was coming out of the 1970s, and we were about to head into the new millennium at this point. And John just felt that there was definitely room to start doing things a little bit different and start pushing the concepts forward. So being a fan of wine, he had obviously seen a lot of the New World stuff coming out. You were looking at, you know, the US as well as places like Australia that had started making some delicious wines and new and interesting and innovative techniques. So he figured that there was definitely room to do the same in whiskey, and set about to do exactly that. So Compass Box was founded in 2000 with the aim to make delicious, compelling whiskies that call you back to the glass and share the joy of scotch with more people around the world. And that's exactly what I think John's done. So 22 years old now. We've actually just celebrated our birthday a couple Sundays ago, and we had some delicious hedonism and some cake, which was a fantastic pairing, I thought. But yeah, I mean, best place to start is if we get into some whiskey, and the first one being the first one that we ever created. So John, you know, as I said, wanted to obviously do things differently and really sort of push forward the boundaries of what was possible in Scotch and the way people saw Scotch whiskey. So he decided to make a blended grain, which was at the time the world's first blended grain Scotch whiskey that was produced. So at the time, what you would have found is that a lot of grain whiskey would have gone straight into blends. It was very rare that you would find even a single grain being bottled for purchase. Because of how big blends were, predominantly it was all put into grain whiskey was put into these blends, and sort of overshadowed a lot of the time by the malts. So, you know, the malt was always seen as the star of the show, and the grain was always seen as sort of the backbone. So it didn't always get its time in the sun. John, having had experience with a lot of these great grain whiskies, decided that he should showcase them and really let them shine on their own. So what you have here is a blend of single grain whiskies. Majority or all of it is all about first fill American oak. So what you're going to have is a lot of that American oak influence. And if you have a go on the nose of this, what you'll start to pick up is a lot of that influence. So massive hits of vanilla, toffee, caramel notes that come off of there. I get lovely hints of coconut too. John actually usually describes when he's talking about finding the grain whiskies that are going to go into this blend, that there's this lovely popcorn note that he gets, which seems to shine through and just set something apart as a hedonism whiskey as opposed to a regular grain for something else. So yeah, if you want to have a go on the palate of that. It's beautifully soft and creamy, really indulgent. Yeah, just loads of the rich flavors, a little bit of sweetness that comes through. So I really, really love that whiskey. Just especially at the beginning of a tasting, it's a great way to cleanse the palate and get you ready for something else.
Definitely. We've already got some fantastic taste notes in there. Reverend Kevin Wright says a remarkably mellow, broad nose for a blended grain, certainly inviting. Stuart says custard creams.
Oh, lovely.
So that's a good tasting note. I think it's quite buttery. Duncan has said it's bold to keep it non-chilled filtered under 46%. I don't know if you have any thoughts on that, Michael.
Yeah, I mean, it's also just with the grain, it's not going to be as susceptible to clouding up as well as a grain. So that's why we're able to do it at that ABV. And I think it's also just, I think if you went the extra little bit, which we've done before with some of the limited edition bottlings, but it starts to get slightly more prickly, a little bit higher up. So I think just to keep that really soft and supple mouthfeel, that seems to be the perfect ABV for us. So I mean, we sort of describe this in two ways. It's mostly like liquid creme brulee, really, but we also sometimes refer to it as a Scotch that thinks it's a bourbon, because it's obviously going to have some familiarity with those sort of flavor notes that you'll get from those bourbon casks, American oak sort of influence. So I love this whiskey. It's really great if you actually do put it in the freezer as well as a top tip. Put it in the freezer, let it get nice and chilled and syrupy and viscous, and
that way you can taste it.
Is a very indulgent way to drink it. I've recently found, I did its tasting yesterday in Bath, where I managed to procure some dark chocolate truffles with liquid salted caramel centers that, when paired together, is unbelievably delicious. So
that's taking your job to a whole new level, doing a tasting from the bath.
No.
Sorry, I know. It was a joke. Yeah.
I mean, you caught me out there. Chocolates in the bath with the dram of hedonism. I mean, the ultimate indulgence, really. Yeah, so I mean, another thing that you can have a look at here, a big part about what we do is transparency. So with all the whiskies tonight, I'll have these little wheels, which are available directly off the website. So you're able to log on at any point and go and have a look. And we like to share this information, let you know what you're drinking, where the flavor notes are coming from, which type of casks are being used, and how much each whiskey is represented inside the blend. So as you can see here, we've got 23 different Cameron Bridge casks. We've got some North British, some Girvan, as well as some Port Dundas. So lovely combination there. You can see the flavor notes that they're adding. Interestingly enough, this is technically not really allowed by the Scottish Whisky Association in a number of ways. They aren't very big on sharing information like this for your blends. So we have to be a bit vague about some things. As you can see, there's no age statements as such, but you can see we've got sort of the rings on the circle there to kind of indicate what ages you're looking at. We're allowed to tell you everything if you contact us directly, so you're welcome to do that. But it's just quite bizarre because, you buy a pack of gum these days and you'll have all the ingredients listed on it. I had a bottle of water the other day that had ingredients water listed on it. Yet when you buy an expensive bottle of whiskey, you're for some reason not allowed to share this information. So
what's the calorific content, Michael?
I wouldn't be able to tell you that off the top of my head, but I'm sure we could probably find that out for you. But yeah, I mean, we have petitioned the Scottish Whisky Association to try and say that, we use these lovely whiskies from all over Scotland. We'd love to be able to share that information with people, but as of yet, they still haven't agreed. So we do as much as we're allowed to. And then, as I say, if you're ever more curious, you're welcome to get in touch with us and have a chat.
That's interesting because there was a comment there earlier on saying, big fan of, hello everyone, I'm a big fan of the Compass Box since the beginnings, and especially because of the transparency and innovation you introduced into the industry. So yeah, there was obviously something that a reputation that precedes you. There's also some great tasting notes in there. We got velvety creamy, would go well with mince pies dripping with brandy butter, says Reverend Kevin White. Been watching too many of the Christmas M&S adverts, I'd say. Buttery crumpets, says Duncan. Very soft and delicate bourbon-like, tastes like sticky toffee pudding, very pleasant and creamy on the tongue. Flowery peaches, raspberries, and a bit of milky chocolate, creamy and smooth. So fantastic taste.
Those are amazing.
So it seems to be going down a treat.
That's very good to hear. Yeah, I mean, that's first one out the gates is always a good one. I love this whiskey because it's so easy to lure people in at whiskey shows, because when they come around and they're like, oh, I'm not too sure, you say, well, have one of these, and while you clean your palate, you can decide. And they always bite after that one, which is great.
Yeah, well, it's interesting because it's one thing that's always frustrated me about as much as I love the whiskey industry, but the Scotch whiskey industry's obsession, not necessarily the industry itself, but the public's obsession with the word single malt, when a lot of the innovation is coming from grains like this, or some really interesting blends, so yeah, for
sure. I mean, we did one of our last limited edition grains that we did was the experimental grain, interestingly enough, which actually had some peated grain whiskey in it, which was quite unique. So definitely, I mean, that's one of the things I love the most about what we do, is that we are always asking questions and getting people to think about what they're drinking and what we can do in this industry to make it an exciting category for people.
Name Killer said long-lasting finish. So Ron Seal Wood Seal, don't know if you have that in South Africa, Michael, but I'm happy that I've signed to your newsletter to keep an eye on future releases, says Kevin.
Yeah,
so
it's a great,
there you go. He's on the website.
Yeah.
And this is I think it's 70. Let me bring it up here. So this is 67.75 on our website. So everyone who will be getting a 15% off that at the end of the tasting.
That's an amazing price. Yeah. Cool. Yes, I mean, I'm just going to go through just a couple slides quickly, just to give you a little bit more of an understanding of what we're up to as a company and what we believe in, and then we'll barrel through into the next whiskey and continue the journey. But We really strongly believe in blending. We think that it is a platform for creativity. And as you mentioned just now, Luke, there's a lot of innovation happening in this space. There's just a lot of opportunity available to us. There's even more malt distilleries than ever before. So it means that there's a lot more options coming through the pipeline, and there's just more whiskey drinkers in general. So there's a lot of people to speak to these days, which is fantastic for us, and it gives us a lot of avenues to explore. We love good wood. I mean, good wood is one of the most important aspects of making fantastic whiskey, and we spend a lot of time and effort in sourcing from great suppliers and making sure that we have innovative techniques that we are using with it, which we might get into a little bit later as well. So we are deeply committed to getting good oak for our whiskies. We also subscribe to the concept that good whiskies don't necessarily need age statements. You won't generally find ever age statements on our whiskies. I think we have done one before, which was actually one of my favorites, called the 3-year-old Deluxe, which was sort of a poke at the concept of age statements in whiskies, where we had a bunch of really old whiskies and then one 3-year-old whiskey inside there, just so that we had to call it a 3-year-old. And it was only like less than a percentage of it going in there. But it's just to sort of reinforce the idea that, if you make a really creative and an interesting blend, it can produce fantastic results. And sometimes you do need that interplay between older and younger whiskeys to really bring out the best in each other. Whiskey should be bottled without chill filtering and at its natural color. So we don't add any coloring to any of our whiskeys. Some companies will use spirit caramel to sort of blend in for consistency purposes. We don't do that at all. We don't want to mislead you at any point to make you think that a whiskey has potentially been aged for longer or aged in different casks for any reason. It is what it is, and hence our commitment to transparency. And we also don't chill filter our whiskey. So we're not trying to strip out any flavor. Anything that we put in there, we want to keep in as much as possible, because that's where all the magic is. And then lastly, we don't have any rules for how you drink our whiskey. I mean, if I've done some fantastic pairings yesterday with everything from cheese to hams to chocolates and fresh fruit. I am doing a couple pairings coming up over the next couple of weeks with beers and ciders. Our whiskeys work fantastically in cocktails. If you want to drink them on the rocks, neat with water, whatever you fancy, that's up to you. We like to say that people should drink creatively. So we're big fans of that concept. Cool. So, I mean, just to break down, in case anybody hasn't got a good understanding of just how blends work, obviously 2 main styles coming out of Scotland: malt whiskey, grain whiskey. If at any point anyone wants me to deep dive into that, I'm more than happy to do that. But essentially, we make blends. We have in the past actually made 1 or 2 single malts, which was part of the Myths and Legends range. But for the most part, we make blended scotch, blended malts, as well as what we've just drunk now, which is the blended grain. So we are taking the best whiskies from all over Scotland and finding interesting ways to combine them to tell our story, or to ask some questions, or to make you think a little bit more about what you're drinking. Cool. So questions at this point, otherwise we can drink another dram.
Well, I'm not sure if people want to jump in there with questions. Some more tasting notes. Jeff said, best grain I've ever had. So that's some praise. These evenings are about education, he says. Andy says, a late biscuity digestive taste on the finish. I presume he means late on in the whiskey rather than having a, it tastes like having a digestive biscuit at 4 a.m. But
for sure.
Either way,
I mean, yeah, everything has its time and place. I mean, I think that's, for me, it just what makes hedonism so special is that it was such a bold move for John to do that when the whole world was making sort of blends, and then all of a sudden the world of single malt was emerging, and he took a step back and decided to make something that was so vastly different to what everyone else had experienced, and show people how something that was always overlooked can be so special. And 22 years later, I'm grateful that it's around, because there's many people I've introduced it to that have had very, very pleasant experiences with it.
Mm-hmm. No, certainly. Kevin says whiskey is a drink to sit down and enjoy a conversation with family and friends. Couldn't agree more, Kevin. So brilliant. Will we come on to the artist blend?
Yep. So this is a blended scotch. So it's one of two that we have in our core range, the Artist Blend. We've got another one called the Glasgow Blend. This one that we'll be going through tonight is the Artist Blend. So this is inspired by Edinburgh. So all the artistic people that have come through that city or still do go and frequent that city, this is a nod to them. But it's also the idea is, when we put it into the hands of the drinker or the bartender, then they become the artist and you can create something really delicious and indulgent. So the idea is that this is a whiskey all about creative drinking. So what we have here is a blend of grain as well as malt whiskies. You're going to be looking at some Cameron Bridge inside of here. I'm going to move on to the next stat. If anyone wants to go back, they're welcome to do that. Cameron Bridge will form your grain component, but we also do have some lovely Klein Leash inside of there. We've got some lovely Linkwood, some Belmanach, as well as our custom French oak barrel Highland malt blend, which will bring some spicy notes through. So just to jump back quickly so you can have a look there if you want to see any notes. The idea behind this is this very much speaks to what we do as blenders. So by being able to combine different whiskies from different distilleries, we're able to really layer a drinking experience together. And for me, this whiskey perfectly describes that, because you'll get a bit of the sweetness from the grain. You'll get that incredible mouthfeel from the Klein Leash. You'll get some beautiful fruit coming through from that, as well as the Linkwood. And then our sort of custom French oak Highland malt blend will suddenly start bringing those spicier notes in. So you'll get a little bit of that sort of baking spice. And that's quite a layered approach that we've taken to it. So you're starting to get a real drinking experience, which is sometimes really difficult to replicate out of a single distillery, whether it's malt or grain, to be fair. So yeah, on the nose of this, lovely and fruity, I get sort of salted caramel, lovely apple notes, beautiful freshness, but also quite rich and indulgent at the same time. If you ever go on the palate of that,
it's like those caramel apples you kind of you get around Halloween and all that.
Yeah, definitely. And just beautiful flavors coming through. So lovely mouthfeel. You get a little bit of that tingle that'll come through from that spiciness. Incredibly well-rounded whiskey. This here, one of our most interesting points on this is, even if you have a look at that breakdown there, 55% of what is going into this blend is malt whiskey. So if you consider most of your blended scotches that you'll get out there on the market, usually sitting at around 25 to 35% malt, we're sitting at around about 55% on this. So it's really upping the amount of flavor that's coming in, and it's also really upping the amount of mouthfeel that you're getting out of it. This whiskey is extremely drinkable, even if you consider that it is coming in at 43%. So it's coming in at slightly higher than a lot of your blends that you will get, which I personally think is a fantastic thing, because I miss drinking 43% whiskey sometimes. But in South Africa, by law, all whiskeys are 43% or higher. And I find that when you come to this side of the world and suddenly start drinking 40%, it just feels like something's lacking for me. There's a back end that just doesn't carry through, especially if you're making cocktails. If you're making cocktails, maybe a highball, longer drinks, having a little bit higher ABV really does help carry that flavor profile through. So I find that to be quite a big advantage for us.
Why is it 43% minimum for whiskey in South Africa?
So it has to do with brandy, actually, because when the brandy industry was first initiated by the Portuguese, they weren't very big on competition. So by making every other spirit category have to be 43% and theirs was allowed to be under, it meant that they were easily able to do with their brandy. And nobody was going to be bottling anything over 40% just for one small country in the tip of Africa. So it took a long time for people to suddenly start having to bottle at higher ABVs. So it meant they had a whole lot of a market share without much competition for a long time. So
interesting.
And it's still the case. I mean, even if vodka, gin, tequila, anything that goes into the country, if it's not 43%, has to be called a spirit aperitif. So it still does affect the trade today.
Mm-hmm. And what year when would that have been like?
I mean, it's been in effect ever since I've known. I'm not too sure exactly when it started, but it would have been quite a long time ago.
Interesting.
Yeah, and it hasn't been overturned until now, which I think is quite interesting. So, yeah, a lot of initial whiskies and stuff that would have come over would have had to been bottled exclusively for the South African market.
Yeah, because I think as far as I'm aware, I mean, I think I could be wrong off the top of my head. I think 40% standardization here came in during the First World War as a grain preservation kind of, basically watered down the whiskey. So I always assumed that whiskey prior to that would have been just a higher ABV by default. But maybe I'm wrong. I actually don't know.
Yeah, I mean, it'll be interesting to dig into that.
Reverend Kevin White says, like honey on the tongue, fruity pear. Gary says a sweet, more apple crumble, honeyed cereal and baking spices on the nose. Quite cooling on the finish, says Duncan, which is an interesting point. Ian says caramel, apple crumble, creamy and buttery on the palate. So there's some fantastic taste notes coming in there, but definitely caramel, cream, vanilla, and apple seem to be the theme. You definitely get that kind of American oak coming through.
Yeah, and I get that lovely sort of toasted oak biscuitiness coming off in the back end after it's sat for a little while. This is quite a surprising whiskey in a number of ways because, I mean, it's such a great price point. You're getting a majority malt in your blend, but it also pairs really, really well with a lot of things. It's great in cocktails, but I've recently, as I said, been doing some beer pairings, and this is one of the ones that seems to shine with like a good pale ale or IPA side by side, because it just has this amazing creaminess that really carries through between the beer and the hops, and the fruitiness just plays together with those hops really lovely. So it's something that I'm quite a big fan of having a dram next to a beer that I'm drinking, and this one is a great go-to for that.
Certainly, I can definitely see how that would work. And you said price point. This is £37. Yeah, so you'll also be getting 15% off that, everyone, this evening. So I mean, that's where would you be going? Martin has asked you just to explain more on the artist blend name. He said it comes from Edinburgh.
The idea is that it's inspired by the city of Edinburgh. Yeah. So, I mean, we obviously, all of our whiskies are sourced from all over Scotland, all of the greatest distilleries that there are there. And we have a bottling plant just outside of Edinburgh. The company was registered and our lawyers' offices are based in Edinburgh. Hence, the original bottling of this before they changed the label was Great King Street. I think that's where the lawyers' offices were based. But yeah, I mean, it's inspired by that. We are obviously based in London as a company. We get, which if you've still got any visual of what's behind me, I've got sampling boxes full of samples from different distilleries that get sent to us of all the different casks that are available that we will then go and taste and nose and use to make the small scale blends that we'll sample here. And once we have those recipes, then we will send them across to our bottlers. We'll usually have one of our whiskey makers go and oversee the process. And that's where we'll go. So generally what we're actually doing is we're dumping the barrels for the blend into stainless steel vats. We're blending the whiskey together, then actually putting it straight back into those casks and leaving it to marry and integrate in those casks for a period of time, which is great because it just gives it a familiar environment to really get to know each other again and add another layer to the experience.
Oh, that's fantastic. And the Glasgow blend sounds more like something kind of violent or seedy. But,
I mean, inspired by the city of Glasgow. So the idea was that at the turn of the 20th century, in the book Whiskey by Inez MacDonald, they were talking about how Glaswegians were just drinking a much more full style of whiskey, much more full flavored. So that is going to have a lot more sherry as well as peated influence. And it actually dials it up even further because inside that blend you're looking at 65% malt to grain, so a fantastic amount of malt whiskey, and that will have some sherry cask aged Grigelicky inside of it. It will also have some Lefroy, so really dials up the volume on that sherry and peated influence.
Yeah, and if you insult my Glasgow blend, you get a Glasgow kiss. So,
yeah, a Glasgow blend. I might have a bottle of it here somewhere, but I don't know if you can see my screen. But it actually does have the little Duke of Wellington on the front, so you can see.
Oh, very good.
With the cone on his head, because while we like to be serious about our whiskey, we also like to have a lot of fun. We're serious about flavor, and we like to have a little bit of fun with our whiskey.
Yeah, no, it's fantastic because Jeff is in the chat here has also said that the charts are very interesting. It's crazy that the industry doesn't encourage it. And what struck me so far, Michael, learning about this brand is that 2000, obviously the brand launched, which is also the same year that Mark Rainier bought Bruichladdich, which is also a massive disruptor in the industry in terms of branding, in terms of how they put themselves out there. So 2000 seems to have been a productive year for people who wanted to stick a thumb up to the establishment in the whiskey industry.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's that whole thing about new beginnings, beginning of the year and you start going to gym, and beginning of a new millennium and you start trying to change the way that people think about whiskey. So
yeah, you survived Y2K, and yeah,
let's go.
Britain
crazy.
and America haven't illegally invaded Iraq yet. It was a sweet spot.
Yeah, for sure. So yeah, I mean, that's a big part of what we do is, people are curious and they want to know more about what they're spending their money on. And I think, worst case scenario, we should at least be allowed the option of being able to choose whether we wanted to share or not. I think, I think it's just a natural thing. I mean, for us, we're whiskey fans. I mean, we love these whiskeys and we're big fans of them, and we love to see how they play around in our blends. And it's also, sometimes you get access to whiskeys that you can't necessarily get on their own. So it's lovely to know that they're in there, and you're drinking them. Yeah,
no, fantastic. Totally agree.
Cool. So just to get onto the concept of blends, there's just I have a lot of conversations with people these days about the difference between blends and single malts, and sort of the fascination that people have with single malt these days. So I like to use a little bit of an analogy to try and explain my view, at least on blends, in the way that I like to picture it in my mind. So I think a lot of people don't always realize that as a single malt distillery, they will be blending anyway. So within a distillery, their standard 12-year-old whiskey or whatever it may be, they will be blending between a range of casks to obviously produce a set style that they have within their distillery. The thing about single malt distilleries is that they've obviously got a house character or house style. Generally, they're playing around quite a lot with casks and finishing and stuff, but often your sort of mashing and fermentation and distillation process is fairly standard, and you're not going to be altering it up too much. So what you end up is having sort of a house style that comes out of your new make that you will then go and sort of shift direction over the years. So whether it's different casks or longer aging periods or whatever it is. So when you go into some of them, you can smell sort of apples and pears in the fermentation stage, and that will carry through into some of the younger whiskies. And then over time, that'll start evolving into much richer sort of fruits. But I like to think of it like this color palette. So a single distillery will have sort of 50 shades of blue available to it. So it's got, some really light or bright blues. It's got some really dark, deep blues. So it has got quite a lot of options within that category. But that's really handy if you want to paint the ocean, for example. So you've got all these beautiful blues to work with, and you can paint some really vivid and intense and evocative images with them. But what happens if you want to shift your sort of view up or your lens up a little bit and paint a sunset with that ocean? You don't really generally have a lot of oranges and reds and yellows to use because your distillery style is quite specific. So you're having to either put a lot of emphasis into your casks and have a lot of extra different casks available to be able to really change the whiskey you're releasing. And that's where I think as blenders, we have a lot of options available to us because we have a full palette to be able to work with. We've got whiskies from all over Scotland, and we've got whiskies that are house style whiskies that they normally do. We've got access to whiskies that they've finished in weird and wonderful casks, and we've got access to whiskies that we've got from them, and we've decided to finish in different casks. So it really opens up the amount of colors that we are able to play with, and it means that we can start painting very vivid and interesting images with it. So I hope that sort of does give you a little bit of an understanding of how exciting it is to be blenders, because it does mean that we have a lot of options available to us and some beautiful pictures that we can create with those.
Yeah, cool. That's a charming metaphor. It's good.
Thank you. I tried. I'll save you from some of my other ones, which were a little bit obscure, but maybe we'll get into them later. But
oils and esters on canvas,
Yeah, so I mean, that'll bring us to a very vibrant and colorful whiskey that we have in front of us here. So this is onto the Orchard House. The Orchard House is a very special whiskey for us because it is our latest in our blended malt range. So this is blend of only single malts. This is one that was released last year. We actually recently, this weekend, have just won the online Scotch Whisky Award for Best Blended Malt. So that was quite a nice surprise. Yeah, thank you very much. It was award ceremony was held over the weekend, all voted for by the public, which is great. And, online whiskey enthusiasts, people who have all their YouTube channels and podcasts and followings, were the ones who spearhead the awards. So it was really lovely to be voted by the people in quite a landslide victory for the Orchard House. So I'm really excited to share it with you. The idea behind this whiskey is that it is a lot more about the spirit style and the distillery character coming through than it is about the wood. So the wood sort of takes a back seat on this whiskey, and you get a lot more of the distillery character coming through. So inside of this whiskey, we'll hop onto the next slide now, but you're looking at some Clynelish, you're looking at some Linkwood, you're also looking at some Ben Rinnes as your predominant compounds inside of there. And on the nose, this for me is just fantastic. You're going to be getting apples, pears. I get lovely fresh citrus like lemon and lime. I also get that beautiful Earl Grey, like a bergamot note out of it, which I think is really good. I'm actually getting quite a lot of pineapple out of it tonight, which is really good. So yeah, just unbelievably bright and vibrant on the nose. If you have a go on the palate of that, it's just super bright and clean and quite crisp.
No, certainly.
It's quite surprisingly so. I love doing this whiskey at the whiskey shows because I watch people take a sip and then watch their face, and it's always good fun seeing the reactions out of that one.
It's funny because I don't know if it's because of the branding and the name, but it's on the finish. It is like a dry cider, yeah. Stuart says orchard fruits in the house. Reverend Kevin White says my wife can get the Earl Grey, a fruit cocktail, says Martin.
There we go. Yeah, so I mean, it's quite interesting if you have a look at the breakdown of this whiskey. You've got, as I said, Clynelish, Linkwood, the Ben Rinnes. You also have a tiny bit of the Highland malt blend, the custom French oak, which doesn't bring as much spiciness as it usually would in some of our blends, but it does bring sort of a bridging to the rest of the distilleries, which I really like. It sort of binds everything together really nicely. And there is 2.4% of Kaila inside of there, which might be quite unexpected because you don't actually really get much peat out of it, but it does show off a little bit more of the fruity side of Kaila. I normally describe it, if you're thinking of the orchard, it's sort of like the bee buzzing around in the background. It's not getting in the way of anything, but it's providing some authenticity to the whole experience, which is pretty good. But this whiskey has opened up quite a lot of doors for us because it's just so versatile. I've had people making spritz style cocktails with this. I've had people making some beautiful floral highballs with this. I've had people making some very interesting classic cocktails with like orgeat and almond and lime juice. So just taking it in a lot of different directions that you normally expect from a blended malt or a scotch in general, and pairs really well with a good cider. We've actually paired this with a cider in an upcoming tasting. So that's a cracker. Goes really well with a good pale ale with those lovely hoppy notes too. It goes very, very well with green melon as well as some grapes. So if you want to add this one to your picnic basket alongside your cheese board and some fresh fruit, and go and have a couple of drams and have a nap under a tree in the middle of summer, then that sort of speaks exactly to this whiskey for me.
I know it's not a bad shout. Kevin says a little touch of cigar smoke, and he said that just as you were mentioning Kaila, and I think he got in just before you. So it is interesting that he picked that up before.
Well done.
That was mentioned. And Jeff said this tastes young. The fruit has new mixed spirit coming through. Duncan says a drop of water adds. I don't know if on the youthfulness, you do get obviously lots of apple pears on certain types of new make, but also this is also a jump up in ABV, if I'm correct. But
yes, this is sitting.
That might also kind of give that impression of the youthfulness as well. James says I'm also getting the cidery finish to this, like a strong Old Rosie. Old Rosie is actually literally the one I was thinking of. Definite sense of summer.
And And I quite like that. I mean, what I love about the ciders in the UK is that they've got that beautiful yeasty notes on the back end of them. And that for me is what really sets us off, because the slight sort of biscuity notes that you get off of this orchard house seem to really respond to that. I mean, it's something that we can actually dive into here, because it's something I've recently found out when I was actually asked a question from one of the gents at the whiskey shop by St. Paul's Cathedral. And it sent me down a rabbit hole of asking James, our whiskey maker who created this whiskey, some questions about it. And I thought it was quite fascinating to learn. So with these casks that we've been using, so most of the whiskeys that go into us are whiskeys that we've been able to get in as new make, and we were able to put them into casks that we had procured specifically for aging the whiskey from these distilleries. But interestingly enough, there seems to been a period between sort of 2010 to 2017 in the US where some of the distilleries were essentially dumping their bourbon out of the casks and then were rinsing the casks with water afterwards, and then using that whiskey tinged water to then go and dilute their whiskeys down to ABV. And what ended up happening is it started to strip a little bit of the intensity out the casks. So we were getting them over. So if you have a look at this wheel here, you'll see that it's all first fill bourbon barrels. But what happened is James was tasting these whiskeys when he was looking at the samples, and he was trying to, taste samples to see how things were progressing. And he was just noticing that there was a lot more distillery and fruit forward characteristics happening, but there wasn't as much of sort of that butterscotch and rich intensity coming from these casks that you would usually expect. So he started digging down and asking questions, and found out that this sort of practice had been happening for a little while, and nobody was really saying anything about it. None of our cask suppliers or any of the distilleries we had been speaking to had actually said to us before they sold us the cask that this was sort of a somewhat common practice amongst some of the distilleries for a little bit. So what ended up happening was, we found this beautiful opportunity in it, because these distilleries in particular have this beautiful fruit forward style. So it gave us the opportunity to showcase them like this. But it also, does make you think about how much whiskey is probably sitting outside there in warehouses that's not currently aging the way it should, because the casks just didn't quite have as much intensity as people thought they did.
That's interesting, because they make such a big deal about their kind of bourbon laws and all that, and the virgin oak and everything. And yet there's something seems a bit odd about that practice, I suppose.
I mean, this is the thing James said to me. He says it's a bit of a prickly subject in the industry, because not a lot of people want to talk about it. But I mean, I think from our side, we're all about transparency, and I'm happy to share that information if it's out there, because if you mail James directly, he'll tell you the same thing. So yeah, I just thought it was quite interesting, because sometimes that's why these transparency things should be in place, just so that everyone's on the same page.
Yeah, no, you're true. It's totally right. It's a bit like sherry casks, so the big industry lie that we all just pretend doesn't happen. So no, I applaud it. A few questions here. Alex and James says, what is the distillery near the town of Aberlour from your sheet?
Oh, so that's usually in our blends, that is Craigellachie. So just with some of them, we have to be a little bit vague. I think we have agreements with them that we don't normally put it on all of the sort of content that we put out. But, once again, if you're willing to ask the questions, we're willing to answer them for you. So it's
a funny one, because there's about 15 distilleries in the town of Aberlour.
You can't throw a stone without hitting one in that region. So, yeah.
Stuart says shades of Kilila Mock, not Mocka, in there. And James has a great question here. Says, do you come up with a concept like the orchard blend, quotation marks, first, and then start blending and marrying to meet the desired kind of taste, I suppose, end goal? Or do you blend some interesting whiskies you have and see where it takes you, and then at the end the conclusion is, oh, this is the orchard blend? How does the process work?
I think it depends from whiskey to whiskey. So for this one, you probably would have found that it was born out of the whiskey itself, that just lends itself to a name like that. Whereas maybe if you looked at something like the Story of the Spaniard, for example, which is one of our other blended malts, that would have obviously had a bit more of intention behind it, where it was all about, a love letter to Spain and sherry casks as well as Spanish red wine. So I think predominantly you'll find that it is yeah, probably mostly whiskey led, and then the rest of it follows. As far as I've found out so far, I mean, a lot of the ones that I've seen and asked questions about, it seems to be done from that side.
Yeah, that makes sense. Marvelous. And for anyone who's wondering, in case I haven't said it already, this is £42. Obviously before you're 15% off. So, not a bad price point coming in there for this.
Yeah, that's a cracking price point. I was speaking to someone the other day in a liquor store when I was having some samplings, and they said to me that they keep buying bottles of whiskey that they're too scared to open. So they said this was lovely because then they don't feel bad about opening it and drinking it. So that's always a bonus, is when you're not building a stockpile that you don't want to touch.
Yeah, no, I can relate to both the anxiety of opening the whiskey and also wanting to have one you can drink. As I always say to people, you have to think of it like, if you're spending £70 on a whiskey, it can be a lot of money, let alone if you're spending hundreds of pounds. But if you spend £25 on a bottle of wine, you won't think twice about it. But the bottle of wine, you open that and it's 4 or 5 glasses and it's gone. And if you don't drink it, it's gone off. Whereas at least with a £70 bottle of wine, a bottle of wine lasts you maybe one night, 2 if you're lucky. The bottle of whiskey could potentially last you, 4 or 5 nights. So you have to divide your bottle of whiskey by 3 or 4 bottles of wine. And that's your kind of logic. So if it's 70 quid and you normally spend 20 quid in a bottle of wine, then that's kind of 3 bottles of wine and you'll probably get 4 nights out of it, So
exactly. It's all about rationing, if you can.
Yeah, well, that's a different argument.
Sure. So I mean, let's carry the journey on. We're going to head on to our next whiskey here, which for us is the Spice Tree. So this whiskey was created fairly early on in our journey, 2005. The idea behind the Spice Tree is John was having a conversation with his one of his mentors that he used to work with at the blending company. Somebody who was very knowledgeable about wood and maturation. And he said to him, we're obviously using ex-bourbon, American oak casks, we're using European mostly sherry casks. Where can I go looking if I want to try and start creating different flavor profiles from the wood that we're using? And this gentleman said to him, well, you need to go and have a chat to these craftsmen up in the Vosges region of France that are making these beautiful French oak staves from 195-year-old forests. So off John went and had a chat to them. And they were making these beautiful French oak staves, and they were actually toasting them instead of charring them. So they were using them mainly for the wine industry. I think it may have also been probably also for cognac. But yeah, they were toasting these casks. And the idea behind that was that obviously if you're charring a cask, that is going to form a layer of sort of that char, which takes a lot of the intensity and heavy esters out of the alcohol. But it's actually the layer behind that char, that toast, is where a lot of the flavor happens. So I like to think of it a bit like if you're making a curry, you want to take your spices, fry them in a pan, and then grind them up because it just really activates the flavor in the spice. And that's the same thing we're doing with the wood. It's just activating the flavor. So originally what happened with this whiskey is we were actually taking those French oak staves and we were suspending them inside the cask as an additional stave inside the cask. This Scottish Whisky Association turned around and said, you cannot do that. It is against the law and against the rules. So John turned around and said, 40 years ago, we were making malt whiskey without even aging it. It was still called malt whiskey. So obviously laws change and things evolve. So surely we can have a look at how things are done. And they said, no, the rules are the rules. We have made them now, and this is the way they will stay. Which these days makes it quite interesting because obviously there's quite a lot more happening around costs these days because of the need. But so what we actually figured out is that the cask was made of 3 things by definition. It was made of the staves, it was made of the hoops, and it was made of the heads. So what we started doing is we started making these heads out of French oak. So what you had is American oak staves with obviously the hoops to hold it all together, and you had toasted French oak heads that were going on. So here in these pictures you can see this is the Speyside cooperage. Interestingly enough, I'm busy listening to and reading Dave Broom's new book, and when he was at the Speyside cooperage, they said that a lot of the work that they're doing at the moment is actually custom and hybrid casks. So quite interesting to see. But there's at the top there you'll see the the staves as they come into us from the company, and then we convert them into these heads that we will then put onto the top of the cask. So we do it in 3 different toast levels. So it depends, like a high, light, medium, and heavy toast, depending on what sort of flavors we're trying to activate in the wood. And by having these staves on the heads of the cask, it means as the cask is aging, it's obviously interacting with this wood, and you're suddenly bringing out a completely different flavor profile. So inside here, you'll be looking for loads of spice, hence the name. So if you have a go on the nose of that, you'll start to pick a lot of that up. Clove, ginger, cinnamon. I mean, there's almost this beautiful spiced apple note that comes through. Quite a lot of fruity maltiness. So a lot of the whiskies inside here are Highland malts that we will then age as a blend inside of these custom French oak casks. So it's almost like a Frankenstein cask, like a combination of 2 different woods. So beautiful on the nose. If you ever go on the palate, you're going to get loads of that spice. Once again, I get lovely ginger. It hits me normally up front in the beginning and goes to the back of your mouth and then sort of warms back through your palate. So this here is one of my favorites. Just such a fantastic drinking whiskey. You can drink it sort of for any occasion, really, but it is fantastic on its own. It makes a very good old-fashioned, if you're that way inclined, because the spicy notes in this whiskey pair really well with the Angostura bitters that you'll use for making an old-fashioned. It goes really well with dark chocolate-covered orange, which I tried yesterday to great success. It also goes really well with sort of like a ginger biscuit or even a chocolate ginger biscuit. It goes very well with brie cheese too, which is another nice one to try. And I have been searching for someone to make me a very good carrot cake, which I haven't found yet. I need somebody to make me a very good carrot cake so I can try this alongside it. And then I think that would be quite a stunning combination too. So just a really lovely, rich, round, intense. You can see that we've got 3 different Highland malt blend casks that we're using. Heavy toast, light toast, as well as a medium toast. We've got some Glenmorangie in the mix at the moment, and some Balmanac too.
Marvelous. Yeah, no. Scott has called it a real winter warmer classic. Reverend Kevin has said completely different, much more woody and cinnamon, nutmeg, even ginger on the nose. Martin has said this one loses the fruitiness on the nose for me. Woody, a bit of vanilla and biscuit. Duncan says forest fruits in the palate. Kevin says black forest fruits in the taste. Yes, for the spiced apple, says Paul. And Kira Costas has got a very flattering comment for yourself, Michael. They're saying this is already one of the best W Club tastings I've attended. Not only are the whiskies outstanding, but the information and presentation skills of Michael are amazing. Great job, Luke and Michael. So thank you very much.
That's very kind of you.
Great for Christmas lunch. This is the best one so far for me, says Jeff. My girlfriend has just sorry, that disappeared from me, Paul. So my girlfriend just made some ginger biscuits tonight. I think we'll have to try this with a biscuit later. And James, that's so smooth. My new favorite of these. It doesn't feel like 46%, potentially dangerous with how smooth it is. Getting a tone of Christmas spice coffee at the end. And that is a great tasting note. And also, this is £49 as well. So I mean, that's that's 2 bottles of wine, folks.
Yeah, that's a fantastic deal. We actually did a limited edition of this. That was one of my personal favorites, called the Spice Tree Extravaganza. So it was for the 15-year anniversary. And we were able to just use much older stocks that we have available of this whiskey, and that was incredibly delicious. So if you ever get the opportunity to track down a bottle of that, I'd also highly recommend giving it a go.
Marvelous. Andy said ginger and spicy, perfect for this time of year. So they're all fantastic notes.
Yeah. So I mean, it's quite an important whiskey for us as Compass Box, at least from my point of view, because this is a completely unique flavor profile that we were able to develop, a lot more spiciness and intensity that you would have been getting from any single distillery, and a great combination. So it really showed that we could sort of create almost like a base compound on our own, like a master stock, if you will, that we will use between some of the other blends. So you'll see it popping up in some of the other blends, and sometimes it plays a bit more of a role where it is bringing some spiciness to the table. But I find that it also is just so good at bridging the gap between malts or even blends. So it just really has that ability to bind a blended whiskey together, which I think is really handy for us, and something that we're quite excited about to have in our portfolio.
Yeah, no, marvelous.
Ooh.
And I would like to echo Jeff's sentiment there when he says, Paul, please send the ginger biscuits to the group.
Yeah, I mean, our address is on the website, so if you feel like doing that, I'll be happy to critique them for you.
Yeah, no, indeed. I'll give you a free tasting pack for the next tasting, Paul, if you send me the biscuits.
There was actually a story that I remember. I was having a chat to someone in a liquor store the other day that when Pappy Van Winkle became really big back in the sort of 2010s, there were stories of people who used to go and bake cookies for their local liquor store owners, so that when the allocation came around, they were first on the list. So it wouldn't be the first time that biscuits have been used for bribery.
Indeed. Yeah, there's some absolutely legendary stories around Pappy, and yeah, particularly bars in America reusing bottles and everything. You know, it's quite a story whiskey for something that I think is not worth the hype. I'm a big fan of the 10-year-old rye. The 15 is gorgeous. The 20 is when you start veering into, is it worth the price point? And the 23 is just not worth, even at the retail price, it's not worth it, let alone £1,200, whatever some people pay for it.
Yeah.
But sorry, anyone listening from Sazerac, but we bring the honest to God truth here from the W Club. And I would just, before I would have clarified that point, because this is being recorded, I love the antique collection. I'm a big fan of what they do at Buffalo Trace. Like, I think there's some smash, the Thomas H. Handy, the William Lee Reller. There's some absolutely stunning drams there. So I'm not knocking the brand. I just think 23 is just doesn't live up to the hype. But so anyway, you were going to say something there, Michael.
No, noted. I mean, that's good. I'm glad you were able to redeem yourself there. So I mean, I think that rounds up the spice tree for us. But it's just another one of those whiskeys where we were asking questions and we got answers. Essentially, is can we do something different when it comes to wood? Can we be more creative? Can we produce different flavors? And for me, very much a trend of what we do from Compass Box's side. So the Peat Monster is where we are at. So this is the final dram we'll be trying this evening, but this is a great way to finish it off for me, because I love this whiskey. But Peat Monster was originally created in 2003. There was a great article written recently where they were talking about how we were pretty much at the forefront of the whole peat race that had started. And having a chat to John, the idea was, there was a liquor store in Park Avenue in New York, and the owner of the store kept asking John. He said to him, listen, can we make some peatier whiskeys? Can we make some peatier whiskeys? And John, at the time, being a sort of wine enthusiast, was also a bit of a home brewer, and was drinking some of these IPAs that were coming out of the States in the early 2000s, where everyone was just trying to throw as many hops into beer as possible and make them as intense and bitter as they could be. So he said, there must be something here. If people are really attacking their palates in these sort of ways, then maybe we can start dialing this up. So he kept sending this gentleman sample after sample and dialing it up more and more. And eventually, John sent one of these sample bottles, and on it he wrote, this one's a monster, and he had the ABV, and off he sent. And the gentleman got back to him and said, this is it, this is the one, what are we going to call it? And John said, well, I think the name is on the bottle. So the initial release that we did of this was actually called Monster, and I actually got to try it the other day, and it really is utterly delicious. So much so that it woke me up at like 2 o'clock in the morning thinking about it. But this is essentially what has evolved from it. So we did evolve the recipe slightly in 2019, just to sort of make it a little bit more elegant, because obviously we're not with this whiskey trying to compete in the peat race as such. Some of the Ardbegs and Octomores and some of these whiskeys that have been coming out these days are really trying to push the envelope on how peaty whiskey can be. Whereas for us, we want a peated whiskey, but we want one with elegance. So I actually usually describe this whiskey a little bit like Shrek, which is quite confusing for some people. But the idea is, for me, it's a lot more approachable, a monster, than you think it is initially. So it's a lot friendlier, but it also has a lot of layers to it. Like Shrek likes to describe himself like an onion. And this for me is exactly like that. So we have 4 different Kaila casks inside of here at the moment. So you'll have a look at them here. And what you're getting is a fruity, light, delicate, as well as a sweet smoke coming through. And then you also do have some of the Lefroy. So that's going to bring your smoke and your maritime meatiness into the party. So what I get from this whiskey is I mean, it's worthwhile having a look at it before you have a dram, because it's quite light. Obviously, all refill cask generally. The idea is that generally peated whiskies do have a sort of greenish tinge to them, which you might be able to pick up in your glass. It's just that they're always sold in green bottles, so you never actually really get to see that, which is I think quite cool about this whiskey, is that you can actually see it in the bottle. You can see a little bit of that green tinge that comes along with it. But yeah, on the nose, wonderful smoke coming off on the nose, really nice and big and rounded, and it gives you a good punch of what you want. But when you get into the palate, you'll notice that it's actually not as intense. There's a lot more sort of fruity notes coming through, which is obviously quite a signature for Kaila, is a lot of that fruitiness. And there's this lovely creaminess, this beautiful mouthfeel that comes through for me too. So I think, yeah, just quite different from a lot of what you'll drink on the peated side these days. A lot of peated whiskies, very big and sort of ashy and charred finish, quite a lot of tingle on them, a lot of them coming out at quite a high ABV. And this is one of those whiskies that I can have a few drams of, because it doesn't compound. Every time you have a dram, it's not getting more and more and more and eventually blowing out your palate. It's just this beautiful constant note of smoke that's wafting through there, with this lovely fruity creaminess that follows. So yeah, quite a surprising whiskey. And like I usually say to people is, once you confront your monster, it's not normally as scary as you think it is. So this is a great whiskey for that.
No, it's just fantastic. Reverend Kevin, who I would love your offer of the carrot cake, says, if that's to me or Michael, either one, I'm sure both say yes. Says, suddenly our living room seems to have changed into a crofter's cottage with a peat fire, room filled with smoke. Jeff has asked, what's the ppm on this? Before you answer that, I will go on to Martin's comment, which says, on opening the little bottle, I was immediately aware of the warming smokiness pervading the room, which is very eloquent, but also just fits in with what Kevin says there as well. So yeah. What's the do you have a ppm level for this, Michael?
I wouldn't be able to tell you off the top of my head. I can ask James for you. I'll write down the notes and try and get back to you. Trouble is, obviously, we're using different casks from different distilleries, so it'd be quite difficult to give you an average as such. But I mean, I can't imagine that it'll be really high. Lefroy's usually coming in at around 40, 45, if I'm not mistaken, on the average bottlings. Kaila probably a little bit less. So it's not going to be topping anything higher than that, I don't think. But also, it's just blended in such an interesting way where it really doesn't carry a lot of that intense peat through the back end. It's quite upfront, which is quite unusual, and it's something that I think as a blender, we're able to produce a whiskey that's quite unusual because of that. So this was actually, this is a beautiful dram on its own. It was actually the original peated element that was used in the penicillin cocktail when it was created. So if you've ever had a penicillin made by Sam Ross, famous bartender from New York, originally an Australian, he used the peat monster as the original peated element in his... I
actually thought that, I just assumed the penicillin predated the peat monster as a cocktail. But
our relationship with New York goes back many, many years in general. My boss, my line manager, she's originally from New York, used to work at Milk and Honey back in the day. So, yeah.
Oh, fantastic. There you go. Jesus, every day's a school day. That's brilliant. So Paul Wright says, I love the smell of this. Peaty whiskies were favorites when I started out with whiskey. Cigar smoke and licorice on the palate. Says Duncan, surprisingly mild, which chimes what you were just saying, Michael. Kevin says, cigar smoke with a hint of custard and citrus. Water adds to the creaminess. Amazing depth, says Scott. It's got no bitterness like some of the smoky ones, much more elegant and inviting. It made me realize I'm missing a proper peaty whiskey in my collection at the moment. So, well, you could buy this one, Duncan, for only £47, Incredible value. Martin says, this is a lovely whiskey, peaty smoke, but more mild and gentle as well. Subtle fruitiness, a lasting ginger spice on the finish. My 10-year-old daughter accidentally started a small fire in the bedroom earlier. This reminds me of the aroma. Well, that sounds like an interesting evening, Duncan.
Wow,
brilliant. Reverend Kevin says, I've got black bottle and smokehead, but this is more classy. That's a bold claim, because I really like this as well. But I think some of the smokeheads are brilliant, particularly the sherry bomb. But there you go.
That's very kind. Yeah, like I say, the idea behind it is peat with elegance. So we really try and bring that side of it through. And for those, I love this whiskey because every time we sample it with people, they're like, I'm not necessarily a pizza drinker, but I could really drink that. Which I think is quite a nice sort of gateway for a lot of people, but it's also just a regular sipper for me. If I'm looking for something with a little bit of smoke, it's such a great one to have, because you're not going to wake up the next morning and still have that scent lingering on you too heavily, which you can be with some of the overly peated ones. And if you keep your eyes out next year, you may or may not see a cask strength version of this arriving. So
Ooh, that's
sneak preview for you.
No, that's interesting. And that actually reminds me of a question that was asked earlier about what was the name again of the limited edition Spice Tree? Was it Extravaganza?
That's correct. Spice Tree Extravaganza.
Fantastic. Brilliant. Well, folks, I would love to hear any more questions. Obviously, this is, I don't know how much you have there, but I just, obviously, the reason I'm saying this is because we're on the last whiskey. I'm just going to find the discount code to put into the chat. Yeah, so if you want to get questions in, and Michael, if you have anything else there on the slide.
Yeah, I mean, that covers it from my side. So, I mean, thank you so much to everyone who went and bought the packs and has jumped on tonight. I really appreciate your time and effort. So it's lovely to be able to share all these great whiskies with you. So any questions that you have, I'm more than happy to jump onto and try and answer for you.
Marvelous. Jeff has jumped in there, and he's going to go through what we normally do at the end, which is people give their preference. And he's gone 4, which would have been, where's my whiskies in front of me? Spice Tree, followed by the Peat Monster, then the Hedonism, and then the Artist Blend, with the Orchards coming last. So it would be great to hear everyone else's favorites while I find that discount code. It'll only be 2 seconds there, folks, and I'll have it for you. Yes, so the discount code, folks, is WS15CBVT, which is the format normally in, but I said I'd double check in case. So I'll put that in the chat there, and that will give you 15% off all the SKUs we've tasted tonight. So yeah, stock up. And then we've got a few more lineups coming in there. So boom, that's in the chat now, and it'll go in the email with things. So we've got Martin says 4 5 2 3 1. Duncan says 2 5 4 3 1. Thanks, Michael. Luke says Stuart 1 5. So Hedonism there, and then David says 4. So far the Spice Tree is comfortably in the lead, I think, in terms of people's favorites.
Really interesting to see.
And definitely followed by the Peat Monster. So that's interesting. I have like forever and a day with any tastings, as long as I've ever been in whiskey, I've always wondered, like, this Peat Monster was objectively, I think, very, very good, but you wonder how much the order sways people, like, when you've already had 4 whiskeys and you try the last one.
For sure. I mean, that's always sort of the process for me, is to try and make sure that the palate evolves so it doesn't get overwhelmed too early. But I mean, it is one of those things. I mean, humans are subject to the influence of alcohol, so sometimes we just get more excitable as things go along.
Yeah, no, definitely. So some great comments coming in there. James says, really enjoyed this evening. Great to taste the range of blended whiskies altogether comparison. Really enjoyed all the info you had. It was great to see where some of the flavors are coming from on your flavor wheel. So the flavor wheel has been a big hit tonight. Lewis says, thank you. This is really interesting tasting. The charts are fascinating. So the charts in there again. Kevin says, so Kevin asked you, it's an interesting question, which how much of your whiskey making involves using sherry casks? It wasn't a thing that came up much tonight.
Yes, we definitely do have. So it just depends on whiskey to whiskey. So our Artist Blend didn't have, or it actually does have. It does have some sherry cask aged linkwood, but the Glasgow Blend will be much more sherry cask influence. So you'll be looking at the sherry cask aged Craigellachie, and you can see. I mean, I don't know if you can see my screen here. Or me at least, you can see the color on that's definitely a lot darker. So that's the Glasgow Blend. We also do have one called The Story of the Spaniard, which is predominantly about, which I do have a bottle here too as well. So that's predominantly about sherry cask as well as Spanish red wine cask influence. So if you're a fan of those two sort of styles of whiskey, that's a great one to try. But we do play around with it quite a bit. And it just depends on the style of whiskey we're making and sort of what flavor profiles. We've got a new limited edition out called the Ultramarine, which has some really old sherry cask whiskies inside of this. So it's a lovely sort of antique sherry notes that are coming out in that one. So we do like to play around with it, and and see what interesting treats it has.
Fantastic, fantastic. And Paul, would you like to try the Spaniard one? I think I would echo those sentiments. Well, that's fantastic. I think we're coming up to an hour and 15, so I think that's a very kind of polite place to park it there, Michael. But it's been a really, really fantastic tasting. Genuinely, I'd like to echo some of the comments that were said in the chat about. I think it's definitely been one of our best kind of presented and most informative tastings. So thank you for your time, and hopefully we'll have you on again at some point in the future.
Yeah, I would love to. I mean, thank you all so much. It's always a pleasure for me to be able to share these drams. So yeah, happy to indulge. I mean, hopefully we can all do it with a pairing of some biscuits at the same time. I mean, no pressure.
or Kevin's carrot cake. No, certainly. Yeah, definitely. Folks, there's the next week we have Diageo and Deanston. So there's 2 tastings and there's still time to order that and get them to you in time if you haven't ordered them already. I think they'll both be fantastic tastings. I'm really looking forward to the Deanston one because literally where I'm coming from now, I'm about a mile and a half from the Deanston distillery. So it's a local one, but the Diageo is also great value just in terms of the special releases and the ones you get to try out. I must say I've tried the Mortlock and it's fantastic. So definitely get a tasting pack if you haven't picked one up already. And Lewis has said, can you confirm the code? WS15 CBVT. So if I typed that in wrong, my apologies, folks. I'll put that in one more time. So it's WS15 CBVT. So Compass Box Virtual Tasting. And that should be right for you. So apologies if that was a typo. I'll go back up.
Looks like it's right.
I said 13. So my apologies there, folks. So yeah, WS15 CBVT. So thank you, Michael. And we'll see you again soon. And anyone, I'll email the code, definitely the correct one, out tomorrow with the recording to everyone there. So brilliant. Thanks very much. And we'll see you soon.
Ciao, ciao. Thank you so much.